Well, good morning. Aloha. My name is Josh Deerdorf. I'm the worship director here at International Church, where together we aim to help people love God, love people, serve, and engage the world. Now, you may not have come into our service this morning expecting to see me up here in the pulpit. You probably expected Scott. Some of you may not be able to tell the difference. We get confused a lot. I don't really get it. We're both two bearded white guys with similar build, similar height, similar fashion. Okay, I get it. Now, perhaps you were expecting to see me singing and playing the piano as I typically do on Sunday mornings. But I'm going to be honest, I really love it when I get to sit out in the congregation and I get to be led in our music time of worship. And I just got to say, Gwen and Maui, praise band, thank you guys so much. What a beautiful morning that we had of music. It truly was a blessing. But regardless of what you expected this morning, we all bring expectations into the worship service, don't we? We all walk through the doors with presuppositions and with some expectations. Now, we've been going through a series called Foundations, where we've been looking at some of the foundational beliefs of the church as a whole and of our church in particular. And today, I want to look at worship. Now, worship is such an essential part of what we do as a church, but we don't talk about it all that often. We often don't take the time to sit down and look at what worship is and what it should be. So I want to take some time to do that today. Now, today, we're going to look at a familiar story, and it is found in the book of John. And most of us most likely don't think about worship when we hear the story of the woman at the well. But we're going to dive into that story today, and we're going to see how Jesus explains worship to the woman at the well. But before we jump into that passage, I want to define our term worship. What does the word worship mean? Now, something that I learned early on in my Christian life is that worship, the term, it's used pretty regularly in Christian congregations, but we don't have a great definition for it. If I were to ask everyone today to define the term worship, we'd likely get a lot of different definitions. So I want to kind of get a unified term for our sermon today of worship. So Merriam-Webster defines worship in two ways, both as a noun and as a verb. As a verb, this is the definition. Worship is to honor or show reverence for as a divine being or supernatural power. It's also to regard with great or extravagant respect, honor, or devotion. As a noun, worship is reverence offered a divine being or supernatural power, an act of expressing such reverence. It's also a form of religious practice with its creed and ritual. And it's extravagant respect or admiration for or devotion to an object of esteem. So Webster defines worship as the act of giving reverence, respect, honor, and devotion to someone. Now, King David, in Psalm 29, 1 through 2, he defines worship in this way. He says, "Ascribe to the Lord, you mighty beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness." So David defines worship as ascribing or crediting to the Lord the glory and strength that is owed to him. Now, what does this look like? Worship can look very different depending on the context, and the context of worship can be almost endless. Today, I want to look at corporate worship together as a group, as a faith family. And I want to flesh out what worship looks like, especially here at International Church of Oahu. And we primarily worship in three different ways here at International. We worship in fellowship, we worship in song, and we worship in the preaching of the Word of God. And we'll talk about how later on, but it's important to establish that worship is not just singing. Worship is the activity of ascribing to God the glory that is due him. And this is one of the greatest disservices I really think that we do as a church, as a whole. We call our music time worship. Now, it's a long-standing problem. I really don't think it's the end of the world. but it is important that we recognize that listening to the sermon is just as much worship as singing is. Fellowshipping with each other is just as much worship as singing and listening to the sermon. Okay, so we know what worship is in our context, right? Worship is giving God the reverence, admiration, respect, honor, and glory that he deserves through the fellowship of believers, music, and the preaching of the word. So now that we defined our term, I want to jump into our story. I want to jump into that story that I mentioned, and I want to look at the ways that Jesus references worship. So if you turn in your Bibles to the book of John, we're going to be in chapter 4. I'm not going to read through the whole story because there's kind of a lot to unpack, and I don't want us to get tripped up. So I want to give a quick recap here. Jesus had been preaching and baptizing in Judea. He decided to travel to Galilee. And Jesus decided to go through Samaria. And this was definitely the most direct route, but it was a route that Jews often avoided because Jews did not like Samaritans. But Jesus decided to travel right through the heart of Samaria, and he came to a town called Sychar. And he arrived around noon, and Jesus met a woman who was drawing water at the well. Now, this was kind of unusual. Women typically drew water in the evenings. It was a social gathering time. The women of the town would come out to draw water together. But this woman comes out in the middle of the day. And this departure from the cultural norm, this indicates that she's a bit of a pariah, a bit of a social outcast. And Jesus had sent his disciples in a town to buy food. And from all indications, he's alone with this woman at the well. And he asks her for a drink. And the woman's very surprised by this, not only that a Jew would speak to her, but that he would ask something from her. And so they begin to talk. And this woman gets a little confused by what Jesus is saying as he begins to talk about living water. And that's where I want to pick up the story. Jesus has offered the woman living water. She's failed to understand what he's talking about. And I want to pick up the story in John 4:16. And Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one who you are now with is not your husband. What you have said is true." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know, but we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. And when he comes, he will tell us all things." And Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." So we see here that Jesus is engaging this woman in a very tactful way. He asks her to bring her husband, and he knows full well that she doesn't have a husband. She's had many husbands. And this is likely why she is a social outcast. She's probably known in the town as a homewrecker, or at the very least as a woman of ill repute. And here's where we kind of see this interesting turn in the story. The woman hears what Jesus has to say, and she immediately recognizes that he's not an ordinary man. And as soon as she recognizes this, as soon as she realizes this, she decides to ask kind of this burning question. Now, we would expect that if a woman realizes that someone she's talking to is a prophet, that if any of us realize that someone we're talking to is a prophet, we would expect the question that they have to be very self-centered. I think if I were to meet a prophet and I knew that they were a prophet, I'd probably ask something directed at myself. But she doesn't do that. She asks this burning question in verse 20. She says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." And so this woman, she comes face to face with Jesus, and her burning question is about worship. She says, I recognize that you're from God. Okay, we've had this long dispute between the Jews and the Samaritans about where we should worship. So the Samaritans believed that they were appropriately worshiping God by worshiping at Mount Gerizim, and the Jews believed that they were appropriately worshiping God by worshiping in Jerusalem. Now this, along with several other cultural issues, this is what led to some of the division between the Jews and the Samaritans. So the woman, what she wants to know, her question is, who's right? Who is right? Where should we worship? And it's Jesus' response that shatters the norms of worship as those norms were understood at the time, and Jesus now establishes the premises for Christian worship. And Jesus says this in verses 21 through 24. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know, we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." You see, the woman asks, where should we worship? Now, Jesus does address that. He says in verse 22, he says, Jerusalem, essentially, he's saying Jerusalem is the correct place to worship. It's the place where Jehovah is. He says that salvation is from the Jews. So you're worshiping in the wrong place. But then he quickly sets that aside. And he says that the time is here that true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So the woman asks where, and Jesus answers how. I think the woman here, she also kind of asks a who question. Her question revolves more around who is right, but Jesus takes it in and he gives the answer as to who can and who should worship. Who can worship? Well, anyone. Anyone can worship God. He says that all true believers. So anyone can worship God. We do know that in the end, everyone will worship God. We see this in Revelation 5:13. Where John says, "And I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, and all that is in them, saying to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever." Jesus doesn't say that only the Jews can worship God. He says that salvation is from the Jews. Now we see this all throughout the Scripture in both the Old and the New Testament. But Jesus, he doesn't really focus on the who here either. He doesn't go into this long exposition and say, hey, you all need to become Jews in order to worship God. What he focuses on is the way that true worshipers will worship, in spirit and truth. Okay, but what does that mean? How do we worship in spirit and truth? Do we use drums or not? Do we sing hymns or not? Do we use the King James Version? What does that mean, Jesus? But Jesus doesn't address the specifics here. He doesn't lay out whether or not to have a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening service. Jesus doesn't deal with how many songs to sing or with what version of the Bible to use. In fact, those issues don't really come up in the writings of the early church. One of the very few details that we do get from the early church is the tradition of meeting on Sunday. A church tradition tells us that the early church changed their worship from Saturday to Sunday because they wanted to observe the Sabbath on the same day that Jesus rose from the dead, which was a Sunday. And so the church established a new Sabbath for the new covenant. In Corinthians, Paul tells the church in Corinth, he says to put aside money on the first day of the week so that he wouldn't have to go around collecting from people when he came. And it shows us that the early church was, in fact, meeting on the first day of the week, on Sunday. So Jesus doesn't address that issue of when. And he doesn't really even address the issue of why. Now, I do think it's important to understand why we should worship before we kind of jump into the how. But Jesus laid out the how, but before we look at that, let's look at the why. Why should we worship God? Well, we should worship God because he deserves it. Our definition of worship from the dictionary and from King David is that worship is giving God the reverence, admiration, respect, honor, and devotion that he is owed. So we worship God because he is owed it, because he deserves our worship. And we also worship God because it's what we were created to do. In his book, Worship Reformed According to Scripture, the American theologian Hugh Oliphant Old says, "We worship God because God created us to worship him. Worship is at the center of our existence. It's at the heart of our reason for being. God created us to be in his image, an image that would reflect his glory. We were created for the glory of God. We were created to give God the glory that his name deserves, to worship him." In Isaiah 43, God speaks to Israel and he reminds them that he is their God and that they are his people. And God says this in verses 4 through 7 of Isaiah 43. He says, "Because you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you, I give men in return for you, people in exchange for your life. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east. From the west I will gather you. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the end of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I've created for my glory, whom I formed and made." Whom I created for my glory. So why should we worship God? Because he deserves it, and because it is what we are made to do. Anyone can worship God because God created everyone to worship him. Now, unfortunately, many people in our world choose not to. But because many people in our world choose not to worship God, it is up to us, church, to demonstrate, to set the example in our worship, because God deserves our worship. So we come back to the woman at the well, and she asked Jesus her burning question. But Jesus, he didn't share the where question in the way that she was expecting. Jesus didn't focus on the location, he focused on the practice. He emphasized the how. And we see pieces of the who and the why in his response, which we just talked about. But Jesus focuses on the how. This is really important. Because when we worship, the how dictates the where. How we worship determines where we worship. So how should we worship? Well, Jesus gave us the two answers to that question. In verses 23 and 24 of John 4, he says, "But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." In spirit and truth. So how do we worship God? Well, first, we worship God in spirit. And this is why Jesus tells the woman that Jerusalem is the proper place to worship. And Jerusalem is where God dwelt among the people. He says, we worship what we know. God's house, the tabernacle, which was later the temple, was the place that God resided among the people of Israel. When God commanded the Israelites to build the tabernacle, they built it so that God could have a place to live among his people. Exodus 25:8 says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." So Israel worshipped at the tabernacle and at the temple because that is where God dwelt in their midst. God is spirit, so we must worship in spirit. And for the Jews, that meant traveling to the temple, to Jerusalem, to offer sacrifices. To travel to the place where God dwelt in order to worship him. Okay, so what about us? What about Christians? Where should we worship so that we can worship in spirit? Well, where does God's Spirit reside? It resides inside of us. We don't have to go to a temple to worship God because we are God's temple. Paul tells the church in 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17, he says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple." Okay, Josh, but if God lives in me, that means that anywhere I go, I'm in the presence of God. Right? Yes, that's correct. Okay, well, if that's correct, why do I have to get up on a Sunday morning, miss the football games, drive into this church, wear a mask just to worship? Can't I do it at home? Can't I just stay at home and join the worship service on the live stream? Well, you certainly can, but we primarily provide our live stream for those who cannot be with us for one reason or another. And the intent of our live stream is not to facilitate an avoidance of our gathering. Now, with that being said, we understand that we're in uniquely uncertain times. Right? We understand that we have members of our family who are very concerned about their health during these times of COVID, and we recognize that. We want to serve those of you to the best of our ability, and we believe that the live stream does that. And we also want to connect with people around the country and around the world. It's really cool to see people check into our service from different zip codes all around the world. In fact, Beth and Trevor Brown, they're off island right now, but they're joining us on the live stream. Hi, Beth and Trevor. And we're really glad that they're here. We're glad that we have the ability to do that. We love our live stream for that reason. But the purpose of our live stream is to serve those who can't be with us, not to provide an excuse to stay home. The Scripture is really clear when it comes to gathering. And I think it's important that we remember the Scripture was written before Wi-Fi. So when it talks about gathering, it's talking about physical gathering in person. The author of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 10:24 through 25. He says, "And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. Even in the early church, people were skipping church. And we tend to address this with a bit of a lighthearted mindset. We make jokes about CEO Christians, right? Christmas and Easter only. But the truth of the matter is, in the United States, more and more people are neglecting to meet together. In a Pew Research poll conducted in 2019, 65% of American adults describe themselves as Christian. That's down from 78% in 2007. But even more concerning than that is the fact that only 31% of American adults say that they attend church once a week or more. And that was before the pandemic. 31%. Less than a third of American adults, less than half of American Christians attend church once a week. And if the author of Hebrews were to write that letter to the American church today, I think it would read, "Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of most." The majority of believers in the United States are not regularly meeting together. And this kind of reveals how misguided some of our mindsets have become. You see, Jesus didn't only mean that we worship God in spirit because God lives inside of us. We worship God in spirit because the Spirit is building us together. We are connected in spirit. Peter makes this very clear to the church in 1 Peter 2, 4 through 5. He says, "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood and to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ Jesus." Through Jesus Christ. You see, we need to meet together to worship in spirit. And Peter here is telling the church that God does not just indwell us individually, he indwells us corporately as a group when we are together. He's building up the community into a spiritual house. We as individuals are not the house. We are stones in the house. And God is building us into a spiritual house where we meet to worship him. Now, I understand. I'm preaching to a room full of people who are worshiping together in spirit today. So maybe this challenge isn't for you. Maybe you know someone who's avoiding worshiping in spirit. If we are being built into a spiritual house, we need all the stones. We need everyone to be a part of the walls. We need each other's strengths. We need each other's gifts. We need what you bring to this spiritual house. And you need what we bring to this spiritual house, because we are part of the same body. We are part of the same house. You see, we often mislabel the church. This physical building, this is not a church. Look to your left. Look to your right. Look in front of you. Look behind you. Some of you are still looking at me. Look around. Look around. This is the church. These are the stones that make up our spiritual house. This building, this is simply the place that we meet. We don't call our house our family, right? And so we should not call this building our church. I think this is the mindset that allows us to avoid gathering. There's an old tradition that Scottish churches held, that when people went into their building together, they would say, the church goes in. We don't go to church, the church goes into a building to gather. When Jesus in Matthew 18:16 says, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, he wasn't talking about a building. The early church didn't build buildings. They met in each other's homes. They met on the street. They did life together. They understood that church wasn't a gathering place. It was a body of believers, a spiritual house of living stones. But you can't be a part of the body if you are never with the body. You can't be a stone in a spiritual house if you're still hanging out in the field. Please don't misunderstand me here, okay? Skipping church does not expel you from the kingdom of God. Your salvation is not tied to your church attendance. But it's kind of like us sports fans who use the word we. And now I had the opportunity to coach collegiate soccer for a few years, and I'll bet you can't guess where. I never talk about it. I never wear any of their athletic apparel. But coaching at Grace was really a great opportunity for me, and it was a great experience. And it was the first time, one of the few times in my sports talk that I appropriately used the word we. As a coach, I was part of the team. I'm a huge Colts fan. And I often use the word we when I talk about the Colts. We just won that game against Jacksonville. We're looking really strong this year. Oh, I can't believe that we just lost that really tight nail-biter. But just because I identify with the team, just because I wear their colors, just because I watch as many games as possible, it doesn't make me a contributing member of the team. I'm still a part of Colts Nation, but I do nothing to contribute to that team's success. I think this is where those who don't prioritize church often find themselves. If they don't contribute as part of a local church, because they're part of the church, but they're not actively contributing to the success of the local team. It's great to be a supporter, but we really should be contributing members of the team. And this is why it is so important that we meet together in spirit. Now, there are other benefits of meeting together as well. And one of those benefits is that being in church in person on a regular basis allows us to benefit from our active participation in the ministry. I shared last week that Tracy and I, we have been the strongest in our marriage, in our walks with God, in our personal lives, when we are actively involved in a congregation. You see, there's something about being with other believers, rubbing shoulders with people who are like-minded and who are joined together by the Spirit of God and by our faith. When God's people gather, this is really important. As Scott prayed earlier, God shows up in a special way. Psalm 22:3 says, "You are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel." Another translation says that God inhabits the praises. God dwells on the praises of his people. God is in our worship. And so when we gather to worship, God shows up in a unique and a special, powerful, wonderful way. And we as his people get to benefit from that when we worship together. Have you ever watched a big sports game? Basketball, baseball, soccer, hockey, football. Not just watched it on TV, but actually gone and sat in the stands. Maybe a high school game or a college game or pro game. Have you ever been to a game that turned out to be really monumental? I got to go to one of those games in 2012. It's the last football game I was able to attend. Went to the Notre Dame Pittsburgh game. It was Manti Te'o's senior year at Notre Dame. And Notre Dame was undefeated thus far. And they were trying to make a run to the national championship. They ended up making that run and made it to the national championship. But Pitt was not having a great season. And yet, at halftime, the score was, at the end of the third quarter, Notre Dame was down 20-6. They couldn't make anything happen. Frustrated fans were leaving early. They were trying to avoid the traffic. They were trying to avoid watching their team's dreams of a national title slip away. And early in the fourth quarter, Notre Dame scored a touchdown, but they missed the extra point. So they were down by 8. At the end of the fourth quarter, 2 minutes left, Notre Dame scored a touchdown. They converted the 2-point conversion, and they took the game to overtime. The game ended up going into triple overtime. Fans who had left, they actually drove back to the stadium. They returned to the stadium to watch the end of the game. In the third overtime, Pitt kicked a field goal, and they were ahead by 3. Notre Dame just needed to get a field goal to keep the game alive. And as the play was called and the ball was snapped, Everett Golson ran a quarterback sneak into the end zone to win the game. Now, Notre Dame plays in an outdoor stadium. And the noise from the stadium, they reported on this the next day, the noise from the stadium could be heard for miles as thousands of people shared in the joy and the excitement of watching their team win. Now, I'm not a huge Notre Dame fan. I enjoy watching their games, but I'm not like an avid fan. But that night, I was a massive Notre Dame fan. I cheered just as loudly as all the students who rushed the field. The atmosphere, it was electric, and the joy of that win spread throughout all of the fans in that stadium. I don't actually feel the same way, though, when I watch a game at home. I might yell at the TV. I might stand up and clap every now and again. But I kind of calm down pretty quickly, even after a massive win, because there's nobody there just sharing the excitement. Tracy doesn't care. And so even after a big win, when I'm excited, it calms quickly. It's kind of the same thing that happens when you take a hot coal from the middle of a grill and you set it off by itself. Pretty soon that coal will burn out. It'll go cold. That coal adds its heat to the fire, but it also needs the heat of the coals around it in order to burn hot. That is why we should gather together, because we were made for community. We were designed to burn together, to catch the excitement of those around us, to share in the joy of the victory, to burden the sorrow of defeat together. And if you aren't involved in a local body, how can you hope to catch that excitement or to share that heat? So we worship together in spirit. How else should we worship? We should also worship in truth. This is the second thing that Jesus says. He says, "But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him." Just as Jesus says that true believers will worship in spirit, he says that true believers will also worship in truth. Truth is the second part of his response. So what does it mean to worship in truth? Worshiping in truth means that the most important part of the service, the foundation of the service, must be the truth of God's Word. And not just the preaching. We listen to the truth of God in the preaching of God's Word, in the sermon, but we also sing the truth of God's Word. We taste the truth of God's Word when we take communion together. We practice the truth of God's Word in baptism. But I think worshiping in truth is one of the most challenging pieces of American religion. I think part of that is because we live in a culture that is not especially concerned with truth. We live in a culture that's focused on preference, on opinion, on my truth. And so I think when we translate that into the church, it often becomes very easy to forget that worship is about giving God the glory and the honor that He is due. Worship is about remembering, realizing, recognizing, and roaring the truth. Worship is about truth. It's not about me. It's not about my preferences or my opinions. That might sound harsh, I know, and it might even sound a little hypocritical coming from the guy who gets to determine what type of music we sing every week. But that's where I want to focus, not on what divides us, but on what unites us, and that's truth. Now, I will say, there's nothing wrong with having preferences. I've been to churches where the music was so loud, I thought my ears were bleeding when I left the service. I wasn't focused on worshiping God. I was angrily looking around trying to figure out why they wouldn't turn the music down. I've been to churches where the preaching has been dry, and I've kind of remembered why I avoided church for a while in my life. So there's nothing wrong with not connecting with every church that you walk into, but we, especially the American church, we have become so focused on our wants and our desires that we become consumers of religion rather than co-heirs of the faith. In his book, The Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis writes from the perspective of a senior demon. The book is a collection of letters from Uncle Screwtape to his junior demon nephew, Wormwood. And by the way, if you have not read The Screwtape Letters, I would highly recommend it. The premise of the book is that each demon is assigned one human, and the demon is responsible for ensuring that human's eternity in hell. Now, if they fail that, then their assignment is to make that human as ineffective as possible in their Christian walk. And the demons in this book, they regularly refer to God as the enemy. And in one of the fictional letters, Uncle Screwtape encourages Wormwood to send his human to churches other than the one that he had been faithfully attended. And Screwtape says this to Wormwood. He says, "The search for a suitable church makes the man a critic, where the enemy, God, wants him to be a pupil. What he wants is the layman in church, is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not appraise, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, but it lays itself open in uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going." Does that sound like our churches today? This may be tough for us to listen to. It may be tough because it may not be an issue that any of us are facing. Maybe we come to church, we love every minute of it, and then we go home. But if you are currently facing a disagreement or a conflict in the church, or if in the future you face a disagreement or a conflict, I think it's really important that we remember that worship is about truth. We are to worship in truth. We need to worship with other believers in truth. But if we're focusing all of our time on the things that cause resentment, things like an interpersonal conflict or dress code, instrumentation, songs, if we're spending all of our time focused on the things that are not related to the truth, then we become critics where God wants us to be pupils. This does not mean that we have to stay in a church just because we visit it once. If we're unable to worship in a community, if we have theological differences, even if we have preferential differences, we're allowed to go to another church. But the point is that these things should not be our focus. We should be focused on worshiping God together in spirit and truth. This is my main mission as the worship director here. My main mission is that our music time, our service flow, our organizational rhythm will be such that we support the truth. Our desire and our aim is that we sing songs that are true. Our hearts are such that we lead in a way that is enhancing and not distracting. It is my true deepest desire that we, as a praise band, that we perform only for God. Now, we want to lead you well. That's why we practice. Okay, we don't want the music that we play to be distracting. We don't want to be so filled with mistakes and goofy slip-ups that we distract from the worship. But we also don't want to be so focused on how we sound that we miss the point. The point is that we lead in truth. We use the music to focus our hearts on the truth of the gospel, the truth of the nature of God, the truth of who we are in relation to God, the truth of salvation, the truth of grace, the truth of mercy, the truth of our love, our life, our joy, our hope, our light. And that is found in the person of Jesus Christ. And that is where we want our music to point. We want our music time to point to the truth. And this is what we seek in our preaching time as well. This is the first church that I've been on staff for, but I have been around the church for 33 years. I've not been involved in a church, as far as I'm aware, that has been as concerned about protecting the truth and protecting the words that come from this pulpit. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but those who preach up here, we almost always pre-preach our sermons. We come in, we have a small group of staff and members of the church listen to our sermons before Sunday. Now, Scott doesn't pre-preach every week, but several times a year he does pre-preach for a group of members to listen and to give feedback and input. He emails out his sermons every week to a group of people in this church to get feedback. I pre-preach, Dennis pre-preaches, and the goal of our pre-preaching is that we want to make sure that we speak the truth in love and that we speak the truth clearly and uncompromisingly. Because we want to worship God in truth. We want to make sure that the words that we share during this time of worship are lined up with the Word of God and that they're clear to the listener. And that should be the expectation when you walk through the doors of a church. We all expect something. My point in the beginning is not that we shouldn't have expectations. It's reasonable to expect that Scott will preach and I will sing. And that happens most weeks. So we can have expectations, but we should have the right expectations. We should expect to worship together with other believers in spirit and truth. So here's my challenge for you today. Look at our church. Do we do this? If we don't worship in spirit and we don't worship in truth, then please tell us the ways in which we're falling short. I think this church, more than any other church that I have ever experienced, I think this church worships well in spirit. I think that the spirit of community, the spirit of faith, the spirit of love is tangible in this church. And it's because of the spiritual stones in this congregation that Tracy and I decided to stay in Hawaii through the pandemic. But just because we do something well doesn't mean we can't do it better. I mentioned that we work hard to worship in truth in our singing and our preaching, but there as well, if we can improve, please tell us. Come talk to us or use the Connect card on the back of the seat in front of you. The point isn't that we complain about everything that we don't like, but the point is that we sharpen our leaders, we sharpen our fellow Christians with the truth. We can have opinions. We can constructively share our opinions with each other and with our leaders, and we can push for change in areas that are preferential. But at the end of the day, disagreements and conflicts should be examined through the lens of truth. I I want to speak to our young people for a moment. Young people, when you graduate high school, when you graduate college, when you decide to move away from this island, and you have the ability to choose a church for yourself, I want you to remember this. You should choose a church that worships in truth. This is something that I think churches don't always prepare young people for, and shame on us for that. If you go to a church that uses the Bible occasionally and the works of other authors regularly, I think we need to examine where that church is getting their truth from. If you go to a church that doesn't preach from the Word of God, but gives good moral teaching, you may not be at a church that worships in truth. I want to talk now to families with children. So many of you, especially our military families, so many of you have chosen churches many times before, and you're old pros at this. Let me encourage you to ask yourself regularly, is this church worshiping in truth? Are the things that are being taught to my children true? Now, if your response to that second question is, I don't really know what they're teaching my children, let me encourage you, get involved at some level in the children's ministry. Look over their curriculum. Have some conversations with the leaders and the teachers. Parents, until your children are prepared to test the truth for themselves, it is your responsibility to ensure that your children are worshiping in truth. I want to speak to every Christian that is involved in a church, whether it's this church or any church around the world. I want you to take a second. I want you to conjure up every complaint and disagreement that you may have against the church that you're a part of. I want to give you too long for this because I don't want anybody to check out before I bring this home. But think about everything that you have against that church. Is that bitterness or anger or disagreement or discomfort? Is that based in truth? If it is, you have the obligation to say something. If your disagreement is based on truth, you're obligated as a part of the family to say something to someone who can do something about it. That Paul challenges the church with this in Ephesians 4. He says this, rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. And Scott talked about this last week. We're members of a body. We all play a vital role in that body. So speaking the truth in love, we are to help each other grow into Christ, who is the head. So if you have a truth-based problem with the music, let me know. If you have a non-truth-based but preferential problem with the music, let me know. I'd love to discuss that with you. I can't promise we'll change every preferential thing, but I do want to have those conversations. If you have a truth-based or preferential problem with the preaching, talk with Scott. With the programming and the facilities, talk to Dennis. With our Keiki ministry, talk to Tracy. With the facilitation of our ministries and the communication, talk to Gwen. We want to grow up in every way into Christ, who is the head. And this next challenge, this might be hard, but I want to challenge you with this. If your problem is not truth-based, if you have shared your preferential problem and things are not going to change, can you let it go? This is hard. It's hard. I know, trust me. I don't like the fact that we're about to put a bunch of Christmas decorations and Christmas trees on this stage after the service. That's not a truth-based problem. My problem isn't even in putting Christmas decorations in a church. I'm just a bit of a Grinch. But you know, our Christmas decorations, they bring so much joy to the people in our congregation that I will get over it because I need to be focused on worshiping in truth. Worship is such a vital part of our relationship with God. We ascribe to the Lord the glory that he is due. We do this because we are created to do so. We as God's people worship in spirit together as living stones in a spiritual house. We worship together in spirit as a family to encourage one another and to keep our coals hot by our proximity to other coals. We worship in truth so that we may walk in the truth of God's word as we ascribe glory to his name. We challenge each other in truth. We challenge ourselves to let go of disagreements and complaints that are not based in truth. We expect truth and we live in truth together. This is how we worship. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you so much, Lord, for the opportunity to gather as your church to worship you in spirit together and in truth, the truth of your word. Lord, I thank you so much for the living stones that are part of this spiritual building. Father, I thank you so much that you are building this community together. Father, I thank you for the ways in which you are growing International as we seek to worship you in truth together. And Lord, as we go out today, I ask that you would keep this in our minds, that we would remember that we worship you because you are worthy of our worship. Jesus, we love you and I thank you for your love for us. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.